Welcome to the theoretical foundation portion of lesson 1. Before we ever open a protocol booklet, we need to understand what the VB-MAPP measures and why it's built the way it is. This deck covers Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, all 9 elementary verbal operands, why they are functionally independent of one another, and the 5 components that make up the full VB-MAPP system. Here's what we'll cover in this section. First, you're going to learn the idea that language is learned behavior, straight from Skinner's 1957 analysis. Second, the 9 elementary verbal operands that make up a complete verbal repertoire. And the third one is why those operands are functionally independent of each other, like a critical clinical idea. And the last one is the 5 components that make up the complete VB-MAPP system, which the rest of this course will walk through in details. All right, let's begin. So Skinner's core premise and the entire foundation of the VB-MAPP is that language is learned behavior. It is acquired and maintained by the same basic principles that govern any other behaviors, like the motivating operation, stimulus control, and reinforcement. So this is a meaningful different starting point than a traditional developmental or linguistic assessment, which tend to describe what a child says, like the topography or structure of speech, without systematically accounting for the why the child said it. So Skinner also rejected the traditional expressive and receptive language distinction because it implies these are two of one underlying process. So in his analysis, they are functionally separate. Like the two skills are separate skills that can develop at a very different and critically may need to be taught separately. So the VB-MAPP is built to answer the why behind language and not just catalog of the what. So Skinner suggests a complete language repertoire is made of several different types of speaker and listener behaviors. So at the core of his functional analysis is that distinction between the mand, the tact, and the intraverbal, 3 types traditionally all lumped up together as expressive language. So a practice Skinner argued masks important functional distinction. And beyond those 3, his analysis also includes listener responding, the echoic and imitation and textual transcription and copy a text relation. So that's 9 elementary verbal operands total, and the VB-MAPP assess all of them. So let's go through each one. So the first operand is the mand. A mand is asking for a reinforcer you want. So it's controlled by a motivating operation, meaning whatever the learner currently wants, and it's followed by that specific reinforcer. So for example, a child says cookie because he wants a cookie and has a history of getting one when he asks for it. So the mand is unique among the verbal operands because it's the only one that directly benefits the speaker. Like you ask and you get. So that's exactly why it's typically the very first form of communication a child acquires, and why, clinically, it's usually the first repertoire we prioritize when building a language program from the ground to up. And the second operand is a tact. A tact is naming or identifying something you're in direct contact with. So it's controlled by a non-verbal stimulus, and unlike the mand, it's maintained by generalized social reinforcement and not by getting the item itself. So here is another example. A child says dog when he sees a dog. There's no motivation to obtain the dog, but he's just simply labeling what he sees. So if you've worked in programs that use the term expressive labeling, that's essentially describing the tact. Keep in mind that tact and the mand can use the exact same word, but they are controlled by completely different variables. So we'll come back to that distinction shortly. So the third operant is the intraverbal. This is answering a question or holding a conversation, and it's controlled by another person's verbal behavior, but critically, with no point to point or word for word match to that stimulus. So, for example, a child says water after hearing, "What do you drink?" Notice the response doesn't match the word of the question at all. So, intraverbal is what underlies conversation, storytelling, and answering WH question. And it tends to be one of the more fragile repertoire in learners with language delays, so we assess it carefully and separately from the tact and mand. Right, and the fourth operant is a listener behavior or listener responding. So it is like following instructions or complying with demands of others. So notice the response here is nonverbal because it's evoked by someone else's verbal behavior but doesn't have to involve any speech from the learner at all. So here is our example. So a child gets his shoes when told, "Get your shoes." So you'll often see this receptive language in other programs, but Skinner deliberately avoids that term because it implies listener behavior and speaker behavior are two sides of one shared underlying process. And as we've already discussed, they're functionally separate skill set that can develop at a very different rates. So the fifth operant is the echoic. So it's repeating what is heard with point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity to the verbal model you provided. So here is an example. A child says ball immediately after you hearing an adult says ball. So the echoic is assessed on the VB-MAPP using a dedicated subtest called the Early Echoic Skills Assessment, or ESA, developed by Barbara Esch. So you'll work with that subtest directly in lesson 2. And here's the thing, a strong echoic repertoire is often a gateway skill because it lets you use echoic prompts to teach mands and tact more efficiently. So the sixth operant is imitation. So imitation is like copying someone else's motor movement. So think of this as the non-vocal counterpart to the echoic, and it's especially very important for learners acquiring sign language. So here is our example. A child taps his fist together right after seeing an adult to do the same motor movement. A strong imitative repertoire lets a learner acquire new motor and sign responses quickly. And just like echoic, it becomes a valuable prompting tool once it's established and letting you model a response for the learner to copy across many different skill areas. And the last 3 elementary verbal operants all involve the written word rather than the speech. So first is the textual. Textual is reading a written word aloud, saying shoes because you see the written word shoes with no point-to-point correspondence to a verbal model or vocal model. Whereas transcription is spelling or writing a word that's spoken to you and sometimes called taking dictations, right? And writing shoes after hearing someone says it. So it's like spelling. And copy text is writing a word because you see it already written. A perfect point-to-point formal similarity match, essentially imitation applied to writing. So these 3 are assessed later in the course as part of the reading and writing domains at level 3. So here's the single most important idea in this entire section. So look at the word shoes across all 3 cards. It's the same response form, but its function as a mand, a tact, and an intraverbal, each controlled by a completely different variables, right? For example, a learner who can tact dog the moment he sees one is not guaranteed to be able to man for a dog he wants, nor to interverbally answer what animal barks when no dog is present. So each of these repertoire is under separate antecedent control. And mastering a word under one type of control does not automatically transfer it to another. So this has a direct clinical consequence you'll apply throughout the entire course, because man, tact, interverbal are functionally independent and they must individually assessed, and very often individually taught, even when they involve the exact same vocabulary. So a strong tact repertoire tells you almost nothing about the strength of a learner's man or interverbal's repertoire. So this is exactly why the VB-MAPP scores each of its 16 domains independently across every level, rather than assuming that the strength in one skill area implies to strength in related ones. So the full VB-MAPP system is made up of 5 components that work together. So the first one is the Milestones assessment, the core scales inventory. So it has 170 measurable milestones across 3 levels and 16 domains. And then the next one is barriers. So it identifies 24 common barriers that can interfere with learning and language acquisition. And the third one is a transition assessment. It evaluates 18 areas related to a learner's readiness for a less restrictive placement. And the fourth one is the task analysis and skills tracking system. It breaks those 170 milestones into roughly 900 smaller supporting skills across 14 of the 16 skill areas. So giving you an ongoing curriculum guide between formal reassessments. And the last one is the placement and IEP goals guide. So it translates all this into the concrete instructional recommendations and goal language. And lesson 2 through 4 cover the milestones assessment level by level, and lesson 5 covers barriers and transition, and lesson 6 covers data interpretation and placement and program development. All right, let's recap. So language is learned behavior, and the VB-MAPP applies Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior together with ABA to assess it. A complete verbal repertoire is made up of 9 elements: verbal, operant, mand, tact, interverbal, listener, echoic, imitation, textual, transcription, and copy text. So these operands are functionally independent of one another, which means the same word can serve entirely different function, and each repertoire has to be individually assessed and often individually taught. And the full VB-MAPP system has 5 components: the milestones assessment, barriers assessment, transition assessment, task analysis and skills tracking, and placement and IEP goals guide. So next, we move in the structure of tools itself. So the 3 levels, 16 domains, scoring conventions that you'll use in every administration from here forward. All right, that ends our foundation and preparation. So the slide is listed through the sources in this presentation. So here are our reference, and you can check them out. And by the way, all content here is paraphrased for internal training purposes only. And for the full authoritative milestone criteria, refer directly to the guide and protocol of the VB-MAPP assessment.